The fall of El Mencho. Inside the raid that ended Mexico's most wanted drug lord, the pre-dawn darkness of Tapalpa, Jalisco, was shattered at exactly 4:47 a.m. on February 14, 2026. Residents who had been sleeping peacefully in the mountain town, famous for its pine forests, cool climate, and colonial architecture, were jolted awake by a sound that would forever divide their lives into before and after. The thunderous roar of military helicopters descending like mechanical birds of prey, their searchlights turning night into day, their downdraft bending trees and sending debris flying through the streets. It sounded like the end of the world, Maria Gonzalez, a local shopkeeper, would later tell reporters, her hands still trembling days after the event. The helicopters, the explosions, the gunfire. We thought we were being invaded. We had no idea we were living next door to the devil himself. For nearly an hour, the quiet mountain town became a war zone. Automatic gunfire echoed through valleys. Grenades exploded, sending plumes of smoke into the cold morning air. Military vehicles blocked every road leading in and out of the area. Residents huddled in their homes, many recording the chaos on their cell phones, not understanding what they were witnessing, the culmination of the largest manhunt in Mexican history. When the sun finally rose over Tapalpa at 6:23 a.m., the silence that followed was almost as deafening as the violence that had preceded it. And in a fortified compound hidden among the pine trees on the outskirts of town, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known to the world as El Mencho, leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, the most powerful and violent criminal organization in Mexico, the man with a $10 million bounty on his head, the ghost who had eluded capture for over a decade, lay dead. The king of Mexico's underworld had fallen, but his death would only be the beginning of the bloodbath. Who was El Mencho? To understand the significance of the Tapalpa raid, you must first understand the man who died there. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born on July 17, 1966, in Naranjo de Chile, a small town in the state of Michoacán, Mexico. His early life was unremarkable, the son of poor farmers, one of several children in a family that struggled to put food on the table. Like many young men from rural Mexico in the 1980s, Nemesio saw only two paths forward: backbreaking labor in the fields for pennies, or crossing the border into the United States in search of the American dream. He chose the latter. In 1986, at age 20, Nemesio illegally entered the United States and settled in the San Francisco Bay Area of California. For several years, he worked odd jobs, construction, landscaping, restaurant kitchens, sending money back to his family in Michoacán. It was during this time that he met and married Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, whose family had deep connections to drug trafficking organizations in Jalisco. This marriage would change the trajectory of Nemesio's life forever. By the early 1990s, Nemesio, who had adopted the nickname El Mencho, a common diminutive for people from Michoacán, had become involved in low-level drug distribution in California. In 1992, he was arrested by U.S. federal agents in Sacramento for possession and distribution of heroin. He was convicted and served approximately 3 years in a U.S. federal prison before being deported back to Mexico in 1995. Many criminals leave prison reformed, determined to go straight. El Mencho left prison with an education in the American drug market, a network of connections, and a burning ambition to become something more than a street-level dealer. He returned to Mexico at a pivotal moment. The old guard of Mexican drug cartels, the Guadalajara Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, the Tijuana Cartel, were fragmenting, weakened by internal wars and Mexican government crackdowns. New organizations were rising to fill the vacuum. El Mencho saw opportunity. El Mencho's ascent to power was methodical, brutal, and remarkably swift. He initially joined the Menchito Cartel, a mid-level organization based in Jalisco that was aligned with the powerful Sinaloa cartel. He quickly distinguished himself not through charisma or political connections, but through sheer effectiveness. El Mencho was a logistician, a strategist, a problem solver. When rivals needed to be eliminated, he eliminated them. When shipments needed to move through hostile territory, he moved them. When government officials needed to be bribed or intimidated, he made it happen. He wasn't flashy, said Mike Vigil, former chief of international operations for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, who spent years tracking El Mencho. He didn't drive gold-plated cars or throw lavish parties. He was disciplined, careful, and absolutely ruthless. That combination made him incredibly dangerous. By 2009, El Mencho had risen to become one of the Menchito cartel's top leaders. But he was ambitious. He wanted more than a middle management position in someone else's organization. He wanted to build something of his own. The opportunity came in 2010 when Ignacio Nacho Coronel, the Sinaloa Cartel's powerful plaza boss for Jalisco, was killed by Mexican military forces. With Coronel gone, Jalisco became contested territory. The Sinaloa Cartel tried to maintain control, but they were overstretched, fighting wars in multiple states. El Mencho saw the power vacuum and moved to fill it. In 2010, he broke away from the Milenio Cartel and founded what would become the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, or CJNG. The name was deliberate. New Generation signaled that this was not your grandfather's drug cartel. This was something modern, efficient, and terrifyingly violent. The CJNG announced its presence to Mexico on September 20, 2011, in a way that would become its signature: extreme, public violence designed to send a message. That morning, 2 trucks pulled up outside a shopping center in Boca del Rio, Veracruz, during rush hour traffic. Gunmen jumped out and dumped the bodies of 35 people onto the street, men and women, some barely recognizable after being tortured. A banner left at the scene read, "This is what happens to those who support the Zetas. Sincerely, CJNG." The Zetas were one of Mexico's most feared cartels, former special forces soldiers turned drug traffickers known for their extreme brutality. By publicly challenging them, El Mencho was announcing that the CJNG would not be intimidated by anyone. Over the next 5 years, the CJNG waged a brutal campaign to establish dominance across Mexico. They fought the Sinaloa Cartel, the Zetas, the Knights Templar, and every other organization that stood in their way. They bribed politicians, judges, and police commanders. They recruited former Mexican Special Forces soldiers to train their sicarios, hitmen. They built a sophisticated network for smuggling cocaine, methamphetamine,
By
and fentanyl
2018,
into the
the
United
USD
States.
estimated that the CJNG had become Mexico's most powerful cartel, operating in more than 75% of Mexican states and with cells in the United States, Europe, Asia, and Australia. The organization was bringing in an estimated $50 billion annually. El Mencho himself had become Mexico's most wanted man. The US government placed a $10 million bounty on him, the highest reward ever offered for a Mexican drug lord. The Mexican government offered an additional 30 million pesos, approximately $1.5 million USD. And yet, for over a decade, he remained a ghost. One of the most remarkable aspects of El Mencho's criminal career was his ability to avoid capture despite massive international manhunts. Unlike many cartel leaders who craved attention and cultivated public personas, El Mencho operated in the shadows. There were only a handful of confirmed photographs of him, most from decades earlier. He rarely used phones, communicating instead through trusted intermediaries. He moved constantly between safe houses across Jalisco, Michoacán, and Colima, never staying in one place more than a few days. He employed counter-surveillance teams to watch for military and police movements. He had informants throughout the Mexican government who warned him of impending operations. On at least 3 occasions between 2015 and 2022, Mexican military forces came within hours of capturing him, only to arrive at safe houses to find them abandoned, meals still warm on tables, beds unmade, evidence of a hasty but successful escape. He had an almost supernatural ability to disappear, said Ana Maria Salazar, a security analyst and former Pentagon official who specialized in Mexican cartel operations. Every time we thought we had him cornered, he slipped away. It was like chasing smoke. El Mencho's paranoia extended to his personal security. He traveled with heavily armed convoys, sometimes as many as 50 vehicles filled with gunmen. He used armored vehicles that could withstand rocket-propelled grenades. He wore body armor even inside his safe houses. He trusted almost no one outside his immediate family, and even family members communicated through coded messages. This extreme caution served him well for over 15 years. But in early 2026, something changed. Someone made a mistake, or someone betrayed him, and the Mexican government finally got the break they needed. The operation that would eventually kill El Mencho began not with a dramatic shootout or a daring raid, but with something far more mundane, a financial transaction. In December 2025, analysts at the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, who had been tracking CJNG financial networks for years, noticed an anomaly. A series of small real estate transactions in rural Jalisco, properties purchased through shell companies, none costing more than $200,000, spread across several mountain towns. Individually, the transactions meant nothing, but when mapped together, they formed a pattern. A network of safe houses and support infrastructure radiating outward from Tapalpa, a picturesque mountain town about 90 kilometers south of Guadalajara. Tapalpa made sense as a hiding place for several reasons. It was remote enough to provide security but close enough to major cities for logistics. The mountainous terrain made surprise approaches difficult. The local population was small and insular. Outsiders were noticed immediately. And perhaps most importantly, it was the heart of CJNG territory, where El Mencho's organization had complete control of local government and police. The intelligence was passed from OFAC to the DEA, from the DEA to Mexico's Secretariat of National Defense, SEDENA, and from SEDENA to Mexico's Navy, SEMAR, which had taken the lead on high-value cartel operations after proving less susceptible to corruption than other Mexican security forces. By January 2026, Mexican naval intelligence operatives were on the ground in Tapalpa, conducting surveillance under the cover of being tourists visiting the town's famous mineral springs and pine forests. What they discovered confirmed their suspicions. El Mencho was there. The breakthrough came on January 28th, when a surveillance team photographed a man entering a fortified compound on the outskirts of town. The man was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, but the gait, the build, and the security detail all matched El Mencho. Facial recognition software put the probability at 78%. It wasn't enough for a definitive ID, but it was enough to escalate. Over the next 2 weeks, Mexican naval intelligence conducted round-the-clock surveillance of the compound. They mapped its defenses: 12-foot walls topped with razor wire, reinforced gates, surveillance cameras, armed guards rotating in 8-hour shifts. They identified entry and exit patterns. They photographed everyone who came and went. And they developed a plan. The raid was codenamed Operation Valentino, scheduled for February 14th, Valentine's Day. The date was chosen not for symbolism but for practical reasons. It was the day after Lunar New Year celebrations, when the compound security might be slightly relaxed, and it was before the weekend, when El Mencho's extended family often gathered, making positive identification more complex. The operation would be led by the Mexican Navy Special Forces, Fuerzas Especiales, an elite unit modeled after U.S. Navy SEALs. Approximately 180 personnel would participate, including assault teams, helicopter crews, tactical support, and medical evacuation units. The U.S. provided critical support, real-time satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and liaison officers from the DEA, FBI, and Homeland Security investigation and breaching equipment. The flight to Tapalpa took 22 minutes. At 4:37 a.m., the helicopters went dark, all running lights extinguished as they descended toward the sleeping mountain town. The plan called for a soft insertion 2 kilometers from the compound, with assault teams moving in on foot to avoid alerting El Mencho security too early. But plans rarely survive first contact with reality. At 4:42 a.m., as the helicopters descended into the valley where Tapalpa sits, one of El Mencho's outer security rings, a checkpoint disguised as a broken-down truck on a rural road, spotted them. The lookout immediately sent a radio alert: "Estamos bajo ataque. We're under attack." The element of surprise was gone. Mission commanders made a split-second decision: abort the soft insertion and go directly to the compound. The helicopters banked hard and accelerated toward the target, searchlights blazing, hoping to reach the compound before El Mencho could escape. They very nearly didn't make it. At 4:47 a.m., exactly 5 minutes after the first alert, the helicopters arrived at the compound to find it already on high alert. Armed men were pouring out of buildings, taking defensive positions, opening fire on the approaching aircraft with automatic weapons. One Black Hawk took multiple hits to its fuselage and tail rotor, forcing an emergency landing 200 meters from the compound. The crew and assault team evacuated safely but were immediately pinned down by heavy gunfire from the compound. The other 5 helicopters fast roped their teams onto the compound's grounds despite withering fire from the defenders. Tracer rounds lit up the pre-dawn darkness like deadly fireflies. Grenades exploded, sending shrapnel ripping through the air. The noise was apocalyptic, a cacophony of rotor wash, automatic weapons fire, screaming men, and explosions. "It was the most intense combat I've ever experienced," said Lieutenant Commander Diego Ramirez, name change for security, who led one of the assault teams. "They knew we were coming. They were ready for us. And they were not going to let us take him alive." Inside the compound's main residence, a 2-story house that looked unassuming from the outside but had been reinforced with steel plates, bulletproof windows, and a sophisticated security system, El Mencho made the same calculation his sicarios had made: he would not be taken alive. According to reconstruction of events from ballistic evidence, security camera footage, and survivor testimony, El Mencho retreated to a fortified safe room on the 2nd floor of the residence as soon as the attack began. The safe room had been specifically designed to resist assault. Steel-reinforced walls, a blast-resistant door, its own air supply, and multiple weapons including assault rifles, a belt-fed machine gun, and fragmentation grenades. As Mexican Naval Special Forces cleared the compound building by building, fighting room to room against sicarios who fought with suicidal determination, El Mencho remained in his safe room, monitoring the battle through security cameras. At approximately 5:15 a.m., nearly 30 minutes into the assault, a four-man Mexican naval team reached the second floor of the main residence. They found the door to El Mencho's safe room and called for his surrender. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. Estas Rodadu. Entregate. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. You are surrounded. Surrender. The response came in the form of automatic weapons fire through the door. What followed was a 40-minute siege. Mexican forces attempted to breach the safe room door with battering rams, explosives, and eventually a cutting torch. El Mencho responded with gunfire, grenades thrown through a small viewport in the door, and shouted defiance. Nunca me cogerán vivo. Soy El Mencho. You'll never take me alive. I am El Mencho. It was the first confirmed audio recording of El Mencho's voice that Mexican authorities had obtained in over a decade. At 5:53 a.m., Mexican forces finally breached the safe room using shaped charges that blew the door off its hinges. They tossed in flashbang grenades and stormed the room through thick smoke. They found El Mencho on the floor, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. The wounds were self-inflicted. He had shot himself twice in the chest and once under the chin rather than face capture. He died at 6:04 a.m., exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes after the assault began. By 6:30 a.m., the compound was secured. The toll was devastating on both sides. CJNG casualties. El Mencho, dead. 23 sicarios killed in the firefight. 8 sicarios captured, all wounded. Approximately 6 to 10 sicarios escaped in the chaos. Mexican military casualties. 4 Naval Special Forces members killed. 17 wounded, 3 critically. 1 helicopter badly damaged, later repaired. For the Mexican forces, it was the highest casualty rate they had suffered in any single operation against organized crime since the 1990s. But they had achieved their objective. El Mencho was dead. Within 2 hours, forensic teams were on site, collecting DNA samples and fingerprints from the body for verification. By 9 a.m., preliminary analysis confirmed what everyone already knew. The man who had died in the safe room was indeed Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, leader of the CJNG. At 11:47 a.m., Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum held a press conference in Mexico City. Today, Mexican security forces carried out a successful operation in Jalisco that resulted in the death of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, leader of the criminal organization known as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, because El Mencho's death was not an ending. Her voice steadied, but her expression of something far worse. This operation represents a significant blow to organized crime in the weeks following the Tapalpa raid. However, one question dominated both law enforcement circles and cartel underworlds. The fight against criminal organizations. How did Mexican authorities finally locate El Mencho after more than a decade of failed attempts? The official story, that financial intelligence and patient surveillance led to the breakthrough, was true as far as it went. But it didn't explain everything. Mexican and American intelligence officials who spoke on condition of anonymity revealed that the Tapalpa compound had only been actively used by El Mencho for approximately 6 weeks before the raid. He had been there before, but never for more than a day or two. Something had changed in late December 2025 that made him feel comfortable staying longer. Several theories emerged. Multiple sources reported that El Mencho had been suffering from severe kidney disease, possibly kidney failure, for several years. This was consistent with intelligence suggesting he had been seeking treatment from doctors who made clandestine visits to his safe houses. According to this theory, El Mencho's deteriorating health forced him to stay in one place longer than usual, likely because the Tapalpa compound had medical equipment and access to doctors. His declining health made him vulnerable in a way he had never been before. Supporting evidence included the discovery of dialysis equipment and large quantities of prescription medications at the compound, including drugs typically used to treat kidney disease. A more controversial theory suggested that someone within El Mencho's inner circle had betrayed him to Mexican or American authorities. This theory gained traction when Mexican authorities arrested Ricardo El Voca Cervantes, one of El Mencho's top lieutenants and a distant cousin, 2 weeks after the raid. El Voca had been responsible for security operations in Jalisco, which would have included overseeing El Mencho's protection detail. During interrogation, El Voca allegedly provided detailed information about CJNG operations, including the names and locations of other high-ranking cartel members. Some analysts speculated that he had been cooperating with authorities even before the raid, possibly providing the final piece of intelligence that pinpointed El Mencho's location. The betrayal theory was supported by what happened in the immediate aftermath of El Mencho's death, a wave of internal purges within the CJNG as the new leadership hunted for suspected traitors. A third theory, reported by investigative journalists but never officially confirmed, suggested that U.S. intelligence agencies, possibly the CIA or NSA, had finally penetrated El Mencho's communication networks. According to this version, American signals intelligence intercepted communications between El Mencho and his family members in late 2025. The cartel leader, increasingly isolated and paranoid, had made the critical mistake of briefly using encrypted messaging apps to communicate with his wife and children, who were living in the United States under assumed identities. Those brief communications were enough to establish patterns and eventually triangulate his location to the Tapalpa area. This theory would explain why the operation happened when it did and why U.S. agencies provided such extensive support to the Mexican operation. As of this writing, no definitive answer has emerged about how Mexican authorities finally located El Mencho. The most likely scenario is that it was a combination of all three factors: deteriorating health that forced him to stay in one place, possible betrayal by someone in his inner circle, and sophisticated U.S. signals intelligence that exploited small operational security mistakes. What is clear is that El Mencho's legendary caution failed him at a critical moment. Whether through illness, betrayal, or simple human error, the ghost of Jalisco became visible just long enough for his enemies to strike. And the consequences of that visibility would reshape Mexico's criminal underworld. Outcome and aftermath of Mexico's new cartel war. In the cartel world, the death of a supreme leader creates a power vacuum that nature, and violence, abhors. El Mencho had ruled the CJNG with absolute authority for 15 years. He made all strategic decisions. He approved all major operations. He resolved disputes between factions. He was not just a leader of the cartel, he was the cartel's center of gravity, the force that held together a sprawling criminal empire that spanned continents. When he died, that center collapsed. Within 72 hours of the Tapalpa raid, violence exploded across Mexico as various CJNG factions began maneuvering for control. The bloodshed was staggering even by Mexican standards. February 14 to 17, 2026, first 72 hours. 127 people killed in cartel-related violence across Jalisco, Michoacán, Guanajuato, and Colima. 43 businesses burned or destroyed in Guadalajara alone. 19 police officers killed in ambushes. Multiple blockades and vehicle burnings in major cities. The violence followed predictable patterns. Internal factions within the CJNG, each led by powerful lieutenants who had been waiting for their chance to ascend, began fighting each other for control of territory, drug routes, and the billions of dollars in annual revenue the cartel generated. Simultaneously, rival cartels saw opportunity. The Sinaloa cartel, the CJNG's primary competitor, immediately launched offensives to reclaim territory they had lost to El Mencho over the previous decade. Smaller regional cartels that had been paying tribute to the CJNG declared independence and began their own territorial expansion. The internal power struggle within the CJNG focused on three primary contenders. First on that list is Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Menchito, El Mencho's son. 34 years old at the time of his father's death, El Menchito had been groomed as the heir apparent. He had been managing CJNG operations in key territories and was widely respected within the organization as his father's chosen successor. There was only one problem: El Menchito was in a U.S. federal prison. He had been arrested by Mexican authorities in 2015 and extradited to the United States in 2020 to face drug trafficking charges. He was currently being held in a maximum security facility awaiting trial, making it impossible for him to actively lead the cartel. However, El Menchito attempted to maintain control through intermediaries and family members who visited him in prison. He issued orders through coded messages and tried to position himself as the rightful heir, arguing that the cartel should remain under Oseguera family control until he could somehow regain his freedom. El-85 was one of El Mencho's most trusted military commanders, responsible for training sicarios and leading major operations against rival cartels. He was known for extreme
brutality,
elements
but
of the
also
Valencia
for
family attempted to assert control over the CJNG.
L85
arguing that they had provided much of the initial capital and infrastructure that could only come from someone on the ground in Mexico. This faction was led by Rosalinda's brothers, prison cell, who controlled significant loyalty of many of the cartel's most violent and had strong political connections in Jalisco. In Jalisco. By March 2026, El Mencho's wife, that no single leader would emerge to unify the CJNG from the powerful Valencia family, which had its own extensive cartel was fragmenting into multiple factions, each controlling different territories and operations. Mexican security analysts began referring to the post-Mencho landscape as a return to the pre-2010 era of multiple mid-sized cartels fighting for supremacy, rather than one or two dominant organizations controlling the entire drug trade. The USDEA issued an internal assessment in late March 2026 that concluded, the death of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes has not reduced the threat posed by Mexican cartels to U.S. national security. Instead, it has created a more chaotic, unpredictable environment in which multiple factions compete for control, leading to increased violence on both sides of the border and making law enforcement interdiction more challenging. The chaos in Mexico had immediate and profound effects on the United States. The fragmentation of the CJNG temporarily disrupted established drug smuggling routes, causing shortages of methamphetamine and fentanyl in some U.S. cities. However, these shortages lasted only weeks as other trafficking organizations quickly moved to fill the gap. Several incidents of cartel-related violence occurred in U.S. border states as faction members crossed into American territory to settle scores or escape rivals. In one particularly disturbing incident in Laredo, Texas, gunmen believed to be L-85 sicarios carried out a targeted killing of a rival faction member in broad daylight, raising concerns about Mexican cartel violence permanently establishing itself on American soil. Paradoxically, while the CJNG's fragmentation temporarily reduced the flow of some drugs, it actually increased fentanyl trafficking. Smaller factions, desperate for revenue and lacking the infrastructure to move traditional cocaine and methamphetamine at scale, increasingly turned to fentanyl, which is easier to produce, transport, and sell. U.S. fentanyl overdose deaths, which had been declining slightly in 2025, surged again in the spring and summer of 2026. The Mexican government, while publicly celebrating El Mencho's death as a major victory, privately struggled to contain the violence that followed. President Sheinbaum deployed thousands of additional National Guard troops to Jalisco, Michoacán, and other hotspot states. The Mexican military launched dozens of operations targeting CJNG faction leaders and rival cartels attempting to expand into former CJNG territory. But the operations had mixed results. For every cartel leader arrested or killed, 2 more seemed to emerge. The violence continued unabated through the spring and summer of 2026. By June 2026, Mexico's homicide rate had reached its highest level in 3 years, with approximately 40% of murders attributed to cartel-related violence. Tourist areas that had previously been considered relatively safe saw increased criminal activity as cartels fought over lucrative extortion and drug distribution territories. El Mencho's death also had ramifications beyond Mexico and the United States. The CJNG had established operations in over 30 countries before El Mencho's death. With the cartel's fragmentation, these international networks began operating more independently, forming alliances with local criminal organizations and in some cases becoming direct competitors to Mexican cartels rather than subordinates. In Europe, CJNG methamphetamine distribution networks in Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands began operating under their own leadership, sometimes in direct conflict with the wishes of the Jalisco-based factions that theoretically controlled them. In South America, CJNG cells that had been working with Colombian cocaine producers and Peruvian coca farmers began making independent deals, cutting out the Mexican leadership and keeping a larger share of profits. The post-Mencho world was not one of reduced cartel influence, but rather one of diffused, harder-to-track criminal networks operating with increasing autonomy. On the evening of February 14, 2026, as news of El Mencho's death spread across Mexico and the world, many people celebrated. Politicians in Mexico City and Washington, D.C. held press conferences declaring victory in the war on drugs. Law enforcement officials congratulated themselves on the successful operation. Media outlets ran headlines but against journalists investigating cartels reached new peaks. The uncomfortable truth is that El Mencho was a product of a system, not the cause of it. He rose to power because Mexico's weak institutions, endemic corruption, and the insatiable American appetite for drugs created an environment where criminal empires could flourish. His death changed the players but not the game. In Tapalpa, the mountain town that will forever be known as the place where El Mencho died, life slowly returned to normal, or something approximating normal. Tourists came back to visit the mineral springs and pine forests. Locals repaired businesses damaged in the raid. Children played in the streets where, for 1 hour on that violent February morning, the Mexican military and the CJNG had fought a pitched battle. But everyone in Tapalpa knows that the violence
As the sun set over
Tapalpa
they
on
know
that
that
August
new
evening,
cartel leaders
casting
are
long
already
shadows
rising.
across the mountains
They
of
know
Jalisco.
that the next El Mencho
is
is
probably
probably
out
out
there
there
like a
somewhere,
prophecy, biding
or
his
a
time,
warning,
learning
as
from
of
his
this
predecessors'
writing,
mistakes,
nearly 1 year
building
after
his
the
own
Tapalpa
criminal
raid.
empire. The
They know that
CJNG
the
remains
war
one of
goes on.
Mexico's most powerful
Maria
criminal
Gonzalez,
organizations.
the
Despite
shopkeeper
its
who heard
fragmentation.
helicopters that morning,
No single leader
summed
has
it up
emerged
best
to
when
replace
asked
El
what El
Mencho's death meant
But the
for
various
Mexico.
factions continue
We thought it would
operating,
change everything,
fighting,
she said,
and trafficking drugs
looking out
into
of
the
the
United
peaceful
States
mountain
and
town
beyond.
that had been a war
El
zone just
Menchito
months
remains
before.
in U.S.
But
custody,
nothing has changed.
awaiting trial. The faces are
L-85
different.
remains at large
The
and
names
is
are
believed to
different.
control significant
But the
territory
violence,
in Jalisco and
the fear,
Michoacan.
the knowledge that
Valencia
we're
family
living in a war
continues to
zone,
operate
even when it looks
methamphetamine
peaceful.
production networks.
That's all the same.
Sometimes cooperating with other
El Mencho is
CJNG
dead,
factions and
she
sometimes
continued.
competing against
But
them.
Mexico's
Mexican
nightmare
authorities
isn't
have
over.
arrested or killed
It's just
dozens of
beginning a
high-ranking
new
cartel
chapter.
members in the years since El Mencho's death, but new leaders continue to emerge. The violence continues. The drugs continue to flow. The war continues. In the United States, the DEA and other federal agencies continue to investigate CJNG operations, making arrests and seizing shipments. But they acknowledge that the fragmentation of the cartel has made their job more difficult, not easier. It's harder to track 5 mid-sized organizations than one large one. It's harder to gather intelligence when command structures are fluid and constantly changing. The $10 million bounty that was on El Mencho's head was never paid out. The Mexican Naval Special Forces who participated in the raid received commendations and bonuses, but no one individual could claim credit for the intelligence that led to his location. And somewhere in Mexico, in a safe house whose location is known only to a handful of people, the next generation of cartel leaders is planning, organizing, and preparing to write the next chapter in Mexico's long, bloody drug war. El Mencho is dead, but his legacy, an empire of violence and corruption that spans continents, lives on.